The morning the smoke lifted over the great Smoky Mountains, Ethan Miller could still taste ash in the air. The fire had finally stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the roar that came before it. He stood at the edge of what used to be a forest and watched the light filter through blackened trees like tired ghosts. The smell of wet soot clung to his shirt. Behind him, his father's old pickup idled softly, a familiar grounding sound against the ruin. Robert Miller, a retired forest ranger with a weathered calm, leaned against the hood, scanning the hills. "Never thought I'd see it this bad," he said. Ethan nodded, but didn't answer. They'd both seen fires before, but not one that licked this close to home. Their cabin still stood somehow untouched, a stubborn square of safety in a valley of ruin. Then a noise, faint muffled. Ethan froze. It came again, a thin, high-pitched whine like air escaping a pipe, but softer, desperate. He motioned to his father and followed the sound around the charred porch. There, half buried under fallen branches and wet ash, something moved, a small bundle of fur, dark and trembling. Ethan crouched, brushing away soot with his sleeve. Tiny paws, claws dulled from scraping. A black bear cub, barely old enough to walk, eyes crusted with smoke. It let out another weak cry, hoarse and scared. "Dad," Ethan said quietly. Robert approached, already rubbing his neck the way he did before every hard decision. "You sure that's what I think it is?" "Black bear cub," Ethan said. "Maybe 4 months old." "And we're supposed to, adopt him?" Ethan didn't smile. He could feel the cub's breath, shallow and fast. Its fur was matted with sap and ash. "He won't last an hour out here." "Wildlife will handle it," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. They both knew the rescue teams were miles away, roads blocked, phones dead. "He's got no mother," Ethan said. "She probably didn't make it." Robert exhaled through his nose, the sound caught between frustration and sympathy. "All right, but if this turns into a circus, it's on you." Ethan didn't wait for a second opinion. He scooped the cub into his flannel jacket. It was lighter than he expected, bones and heartbeat pressed against his chest. The cub whimpered once, then went still as if surrendering to warmth. In that moment, Ethan's hands stopped shaking for the first time since the fire. Back inside, they cleared a space near the hearth. Robert laid down an old blanket. Ethan wrapped the cub carefully and checked for burns. The pads of its paws were cracked, the fur along its side singed. He dabbed them with cool water, working gently. "You ever treat a bear before?" Robert asked. "Not officially," Ethan said. "But Mom raised 2 raccoons, remember? Those raccoons didn't weigh 30 pounds. He doesn't yet." Robert grunted, key word being yet. When Ethan reached for a bottle of infant formula from their emergency kit, Robert sighed. "You're really doing this. If we don't, no one will." The cub's eyes fluttered open, revealing honey-colored irises that seemed far too aware. For a second, it looked straight at him, unblinking. Something about that gaze, not fear, but recognition, lodged in Ethan's chest. He didn't name it yet, but it felt like being chosen. He stayed beside the cub until nightfall, feeding it drop by drop. Each time it whimpered, his hand steadied instinctively. When exhaustion finally dragged him into sleep, the cub's breathing had evened into a soft rhythm. Robert watched from the doorway, shaking his head with reluctant amusement. He'd seen that look before, the same one his son wore when he fixed his first broken bike or nursed a stray bird in a shoebox. "You always pick the lost ones," Robert muttered. Ethan didn't hear him. At dawn, the cub stirred. Its paw twitched against Ethan's hand. Robert walked in carrying coffee, stopped short. "He made it," Ethan nodded. "He's tougher than he looks." "Got a name?" "Not yet," Ethan said. "He'll tell me." Robert chuckled. God help us when he starts talking. They both laughed, a rare sound after days of silence. Over breakfast, Robert called Dr. Layla Harper, a local wildlife biologist. She'd worked with black bears for years and had helped build a small rehabilitation enclosure outside Gatlinburg. When she arrived that afternoon, her truck kicked up a trail of dust through the charred valley. The smell of antiseptic and pine oil followed her inside. She crouched beside the cub, running practiced fingers along its ribs. "Malnourished but stable," she said. "You did well." "So we can keep him for a while?" Ethan asked. "Temporarily," Layla replied. "He needs warmth formula and quiet, and he needs to remember he's a bear, not a pet." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Try telling that to my son." Layla smiled unfazed. "It's a fine line, Mr. Miller. Rescue's compassion, imprinting's captivity." Her words hung in the air. Outside, the wind carried the faint hiss of smoldering wood. Ethan knew she was right that the cub didn't belong in their world. But for now, survival came first. As Layla packed her kit, she added gently, "He's lucky you found him. Fires scatter families. It's rare for a cub this small to make it out." Robert looked out the window at the hills. "Lucky runs both ways," he said quietly. The next days passed in slow rhythm, feedings every 3 hours. Soft music playing at night to calm the cub. Ethan built a small crib from leftover wood-sanded edges, tower lining. Robert didn't say anything, but one evening Ethan came home from the shop to find his father silently reinforcing the base with extra screws. "Didn't hold right," Robert muttered. Ethan only smiled. Small acts spoke louder than approval. They named the cub Moose, partly because of his oversized paws, partly because the name just fit his clumsy dignity. Moose's recovery wasn't easy. Some nights he whimpered in his sleep, small sounds that made Ethan sit up instantly. Other nights, the cabin filled with a peace that felt almost sacred, just the crackle of the fireplace and the rhythm of shared breath. On the 4th night, rain began to fall. The sound against the tin roof made Moose flinch. He buried his head against Ethan's arm, trembling. Ethan rubbed his back gently. "It's okay, buddy. It's just water, not fire." The cub's shaking eased. His breath slowed. And for the first time since the wildfire, Ethan felt the quiet not as emptiness, but as healing. Outside, the forest hissed with rain, the first step toward green. Sometimes healing begins where the damage is still visible. The mountains would scar, but they would live. Ethan didn't know it yet, but that same rule would apply to him. Days later, when Layla returned for a checkup, she found Moose standing wobbly, determined. She smiled. "Looks like you've got yourself a fighter." "He's stubborn," Ethan said. "Must have learned it here," Robert muttered. Layla jotted notes, then paused. "Ethan, you understand this is temporary, right? He'll need to join the sanctuary once he's strong." Ethan nodded, though his chest tightened. "Yeah, I get it." Layla's tone softened. "You're giving him a chance most don't get. Just remember, survival isn't the same as belonging." That night, as Ethan sat by the cub's box, Robert brought 2 mugs of coffee and sat beside him. They watched Moose doze, his chest rising and falling under the blanket. "She's right, you know," Robert said. "He'll have to go someday." Ethan nodded slowly. "Maybe. But for now, he's here." Robert studied his son's face, then the cub's paw draped over his hand. "Your mom used to say the same thing, that caring doesn't have to last forever to mean something." The fire crackled. Rain tapped the window. Somewhere outside, a single owl called a sound that felt like a promise of normalcy returning. For a long while, neither of them spoke. When Moose stirred again, he made a small noise, low and rough, almost like he was trying to copy the sound Ethan made when saying his name. Ethan looked at his father. "Did you hear that?" Robert smiled faintly. "If that bear starts talking, I'm charging rent." Ethan laughed softly. "Deal." In the quiet that followed, Moose's tiny paw flexed against his sleeve, a faint gesture of trust. The smell of rain drifted through the open window, mixing with the faint smoke of the dying fire. Nature wounded, but alive. The same could be said for the people in that cabin. What they didn't know yet was that this small rescue, this fragile choice between wild and human, was just the beginning. In the weeks to come, Moose would surprise them both in ways no one could have predicted. But for now, there was only the heartbeat of rain, the soft sound of recovery, and a new kind of silence, not empty, but waiting. Tomorrow, Moose would take his first steps, and the line between animal instinct and human understanding would begin to blur, one sound at a time. By the time the first frost crept down the ridges of the Great Smoky Mountains, the cabin had found a rhythm. Every sunrise began the same way, with a small gruff sound from the wooden crate by the fireplace and Ethan's half-asleep voice answering morning moose. The bear cub would stretch yawn wide enough to show two tiny teeth and immediately demand breakfast. Ethan had learned to mix the formula just right, warm, not hot, thick enough to fill, but easy to swallow. Moose would drain the bottle and then stare up with eyes that seemed to say, "Now what?" That question became the rhythm of their days. Ethan built a schedule like clockwork. Feed, clean, stretch, rest, repeat. At first, Moose couldn't stand on his own for long. His front paw still trembled from the old injury, so Ethan improvised a sling using an old ranger's belt. Robert called it ridiculous, yet one morning Ethan found him reinforcing the stitching without a word. It was the quiet sort of teamwork they'd perfected, the kind that didn't need discussion. Dr. B. Layla Harper stopped by every few days, her notebook filling with observations. "His progress is ahead of schedule," she said once, watching Moose chase a sock across the floor. "He's got good instincts," Ethan smirked. "Or a vendetta against laundry." Layla smiled, but then turned serious. "Just remember he's learning from you. Every sound, every gesture, that's his world right now. Make sure what he copies will help him when he goes back." That idea stuck with Ethan. He realized that he wasn't just keeping the cub alive, he was teaching him how to live again. So he began to act differently, slower, calmer, more deliberate. When Moose stumbled, Ethan waited before helping. When Moose growled in frustration, Ethan didn't scold. He answered in low tones, letting the cub read his calm. Slowly, Moose learned balance. His paw healed his movements, steadied, and the cabin filled with a strange new kind of music, the rhythm of recovery. Robert, who had sworn he wouldn't get attached, found himself lingering longer each day. One evening, Ethan came in from the shed and found his father sitting cross-legged by the crate, reading aloud from a newspaper. "You know he can't read right," Ethan said. "You don't know that," Robert replied. Moose blinked, unimpressed. "Fine, maybe he prefers sports," Ethan teased. Robert grinned. "He just likes my voice better than yours." It was the first time the cabin had sounded like home again. Still caring for a wild animal came with rules. Ethan started researching black bear behavior, their diet, their sleep cycles, their social instincts. He discovered that cubs learn by mimicry. Every action is a lesson. That knowledge reshaped everything. He began adding small-mouthed tasks, letting Moose forage for food, hidden under piles of leaves in the yard, encouraging him to climb low logs and rewarding curiosity instead of comfort. Each step looked like play but built survival muscle. There were failures too. The night Moose discovered the pantry chaos erupted. A crash, a growl, a bag of oats shredded like confetti. Ethan rushed in to find the cubs standing on the counter covered in flour and pride. "You planning to bake something?" Ethan asked. Moose sneezed. Robert laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. "Looks like your boy's a chef now." It took an hour to clean up, but something about the scene, the laughter, the mess, the smell of burnt toast felt like proof they were healing too. That winter brought more than cold. The first storm hit hard. Wind rattled the roof. Thunder rolled through the valley and Moose panicked. He paced, snorted, and clawed at the door. Ethan knelt beside him, keeping his hand close, but not forcing touch. "You're safe," he whispered. "It's not fire, just sky noise." The cub hesitated, then pressed against him, shaking. They sat like that for an hour until the thunder faded. Later, when Moose finally fell asleep, Ethan stayed awake watching the rain wash soot from the window panes. The world outside was changing. Maybe they were too. It was during one of these quiet nights that the lesson hit him, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just settles in slowly. Survival wasn't just about feeding and sheltering. It was about reminding something wild that it could still trust the world. He thought about that a lot. How many people after loss or disaster needed the same kind of patience he was giving Moose? Maybe healing in any species starts with being seen, not fixed. By January, Moose had doubled in size and energy. The cabin became a playground couch, cushions overturned, boots, relocated firewood, mysteriously borrowed. Robert started keeping his slippers on a high shelf. "You sure this isn't a raccoon in disguise?" he grumbled. Ethan shrugged. Smarter than one. But he was secretly proud every act of mischief was proof of vitality. Layla's next visit brought news. "He's strong enough for short outdoor sessions," she said. "Let him explore, but stay close. Bears learn boundaries fast, but they test faster." Ethan followed her advice. The first outing was cautious. He led Moose into the backyard, the air sharp with pine and frost. The cub sniffed the ground, paused, then bounded forward, nose twitching at every scent. Ethan kept his distance, watching. For the first time, the cub wasn't looking back for reassurance. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. That night, Ethan told his father about it over dinner. "He didn't wait for me. He just went." Robert smiled. "Sounds like raising you." They both laughed. Then Robert said something he rarely did. "You've done right by him, son. That's not easy work." Ethan didn't reply. Praise from his father came in small doses, but it landed deep. Weeks turned into months. The snow melted, revealing green shoots beneath the soot. Moose's fur thickened to a glossy black. He developed a peculiar habit of grumbling back whenever Ethan spoke low, rhythmic sounds that almost matched the tone of human speech. At first, Ethan thought it coincidence, but one afternoon after saying, "Oh," Moose the cub growled something that sounded eerily like "no." Robert nearly dropped his mug. "He just talked." Ethan laughed. "He's been listening to you too much." Layla confirmed that vocal mimicry wasn't impossible. Bears communicate through pitch variation. If he's imitating tone, it means high social bonding. Robert frowned. "Translation. He sees you as family," she said. That night, Ethan sat on the porch with Moose beside him, both staring into the forest. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called, and Moose grunted softly as if answering. Ethan smiled. "You'll be out there someday," he said quietly. Moose looked up, blinked once, then leaned against his arm. Through the months, Ethan learned that recovery wasn't linear. Some days Moose regressed, hiding from sounds or refusing food. Other days he was bold, climbing too high, testing boundaries. The lesson wasn't about control, it was about consistency. Healing didn't need speed, it needed repetition. Routine became the language they both understood. Robert watched the change in his son with quiet pride. The man who once rushed every fix now worked with patience. He no longer tried to outmuscle problems. He met them with steadiness. "You're different," Robert said one evening as they cleaned up the porch. "You used to fight storms, now you ride them." Ethan smiled. "Maybe the bear's teaching me." Layla began planning Moose's next stage transition training for release. Ethan listened, but avoided eye contact. Part of him knew this was the goal. The other part dreaded the silence that would follow. He kept working, building a small outdoor pen, letting Moose spend longer hours outside. He noticed how the cub moved now, confident, sure-footed, no longer limping. Every time Moose turned his head toward the forest, Ethan's chest tightened. It was pride mixed with ache, the same emotion any parent feels when their child starts walking toward the world. The day Moose climbed his first full tree, Ethan and Robert watched from below. The cub reached a high branch, paused, then looked down as if checking if they were still there. "He'll be fine," Robert said. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I know." That evening, when the sun dipped low and the forest glowed gold through the trees, Ethan sat on the porch again. Moose lay beside him, chewing lazily on a stick. The air smelled of thawing soil and pine. Somewhere beyond the hills, smoke from controlled burns rose in gentle curls, reminders of destruction that led to renewal. He thought about the wildfire months ago, how the world had looked dead then, and how much life it held now. Maybe that was the point all along. Sometimes you don't rebuild what was. You learn to live differently. He looked down at the cub who was watching the forest with quiet curiosity. "You're ready for bigger things," Ethan whispered. Moose made a low sound, half growl, half sigh, something between understanding and refusal. Ethan laughed softly. "Don't argue. You're talking too much already." As the last light faded, Robert called from the doorway. "You coming in?" "In a bit," Ethan said. He stayed there listening to the sounds of night returning to a forest that had once been silent, the wind, the owls, the soft rustle of something alive in the brush. It all felt like a promise kept. Tomorrow, Moose would meet new visitors, neighbors, strangers, and challenges that would test how much he'd really learned. And that's when the world would discover that this bear didn't just listen. He answered. By the time spring painted the Smoky Mountains green again, Moose had turned from a fragile cub into a bold, mischievous young black bear. His coat had grown thick and glossy, and his eyes held a strange mix of intelligence and humor. The kind of look that said he understood more than anyone expected. Ethan had stopped keeping track of Moose's milestones because new ones appeared daily, climbing trees without hesitation, rolling logs for insects, tugging boots just to get a reaction. But one morning, something happened that changed everything. It started in the kitchen. Ethan was packing gear for a fence repair when Moose nudged the empty milk bottle across the floor, huffed, and gave a low, drawn-out sound that unmistakably resembled more. Ethan froze, turned, and blinked. "Say that again." Moose grumbled louder. Same pitch, same rhythm. "Mo." Robert, half listening from the porch, burst out laughing. "Guess you've raised yourself a smart mouth." Ethan didn't answer. He knelt, met Moose's gaze, and whispered, "You trying to talk to me?" The bear tilted his head, let out a shorter, questioning sound, not a mimic, but a reply. That moment felt impossible and yet completely natural, like the next step in a conversation that had been going on silently for months. Over the following days, Moose's talking only grew more distinct. When Ethan scolded him for pawing the fridge, Moose gave a sound that eerily echoed, "No." When Robert accidentally stepped on his tail, Moose barked out something close to ow. It wasn't English, of course, not real words, but tonal mimicry, a near-perfect imitation of rhythm and inflection. Dr. Layla Harper called in to witness recorded hours of footage. "He's mirroring you," she explained. "Black bears are capable of complex vocalization patterns. Most just never have enough human interaction to practice them." Robert folded his arms. "So what you're saying is, I'm living with a furry parrot?" "Not quite." Layla smiled. "He's using sound to connect, not to copy. There's a difference." Ethan started experimenting. He'd say, "Sit," and Moose would grunt a short, sitting down like a child, humoring a parent. When he said, "Good boy," Moose would exhale a satisfied huff that sounded almost like laughter. The first time he played music, Moose hummed along to the low notes. It wasn't just mimicry anymore. It was rhythm, shared tone conversation without words. The internet would have gone wild over it, but Ethan kept it private. It felt too personal, like sharing a secret not meant for crowds. One afternoon, as the sky turned the color of melted copper, a neighbor named Hank dropped by with fence supplies. The moment Hank stepped out of his truck, Moose appeared at the doorway, chest puffed, emitting a deep growl. "Easy," Ethan said, but the bear's eyes locked on the stranger. "I'm not here to steal your lunch," Hank muttered. Moose grunted loud, almost like, "Go." Hank blinked. "Did he just tell me to leave?" Robert chuckled. "If he did, he's got good manners." He didn't say it twice. Ethan placed a calming hand on Moose's shoulder. "He's protective, that's all." Hank grinned nervously. "Protective, that's a whole security system." After that, Moose's talking turned into a neighborhood legend. Word spread and visitors arrived to hear the chatty bear. Some thought it was a trick, others were just curious. Ethan hated the attention but couldn't deny the fascination. Moose, however, didn't perform on command. He chose when to speak, mostly to Ethan, occasionally to Robert, never to strangers. When a local news crew offered to film, Ethan refused. "He's not entertainment," he told them. "He's communication in fur." Layla suggested recording his sounds for research. Together, they compared Moose's grunts to common black bear vocalizations, warning calls, cub cries, social hums. "His tone falls in between communication categories," she said, listening through headphones. "It's like he's building bridges between our language and his." Ethan smiled. "Guess he's bilingual." That night, as Moose dozed by the hearth, Ethan sat in the dim light and whispered, "You know you've changed everything, right?" Moose shifted, half asleep, and muttered something soft that sounded suspiciously like, "Yeah." The deeper mystery wasn't how he talked, it was why he chose to. Animals mimic out of fear, need, or bonding. Moose's voice wasn't mimicry, it was connection. He seemed to sense emotion echoing Ethan's tone more than his words. When Ethan was calm, Moose's sounds were low and rhythmic. When he was tense, Moose growled short and sharp. It became a mirror, one that revealed more about Ethan than the bear. He realized that his own moods shaped the way Moose spoke. The cub wasn't just learning language, he was learning empathy. It wasn't all heartwarming. Communication brought comedy and chaos. One morning, Moose decided to test boundaries. Ethan told him, "No climbing the table." Moose responded with a firm no, and climbed anyway. Robert nearly choked on his coffee. "He's arguing now." Ethan sighed. "Yeah, just like a teenager." Later that day, Moose refused to go inside during the rain. Ethan shouted, "Come and Moose bellowed." The bear's stubbornness turned every command into a conversation. "Congratulations," Robert said dryly. "You've raised a talking toddler with claws." Yet beneath the humor was something profound. Watching Moose learn language forced Ethan to rethink communication itself. He realized that most of what passed between them had little to do with words, it was rhythm. Patience, presence. Humans fill silence with noise. Moose filled it with attention. The bear taught him that listening mattered more than speaking, that tone could carry more kindness than explanation. It was a small but radical shift in how Ethan approached not only animals but people. Layla noticed the same during her visits. "Most rescues struggle to reintroduce animals because they imprint too deeply," she said. "But Moose hasn't forgotten he's a bear. He's just learned that connection doesn't erase instinct." It was a subtle balance, half domestic, half wild. The more Moose talked, the more he reminded them how thin that boundary was. One evening, Ethan and Robert sat on the porch watching Moose explore the yard. The bear poked at a garden hose, growled at a passing bee, then ambled back to Ethan's chair. "You think he knows he's different?" Robert asked. "Maybe," Ethan said. "But I don't think he minds." Robert nodded. "Can't decide if that's comforting or terrifying." They laughed quietly, watching Moose curl up near the steps, mumbling soft, sleepy syllables that sounded like a lullaby in his own language. A few days later, Layla brought an audio recorder to capture Moose's full range of sounds. They played recordings of other bears, roars, moans, mating calls, and Moose responded with curious mimicry. When he heard a mother's call, he paused, head tilted, then made a short, high sound almost like an answer. Layla lowered the volume. "He remembers," she said quietly. Ethan swallowed hard. Maybe he's calling back. It was a moment both heartbreaking and beautiful, proof that memory survived even through fire and fear. As months passed, the bond between man and bear grew deeper, but also more fragile. The more Moose learned, the clearer it became that he was outgrowing the cabin. He was starting to crave space, to climb higher, to stare longer toward the forest line. Sometimes he'd wander too far, and Ethan would find him sitting by the stream, looking at his reflection, humming low. "You thinking of leaving?" Ethan would ask. Moose never answered directly, but his eyes said enough. The local sanctuary had begun asking for updates. Layla hinted gently that soon it would be time for release. "He's healthy, alert, and independent. That's the goal," she said. Ethan nodded, though his throat felt tight. "I know." Robert put a hand on his shoulder. "You gave him a life. That's more than most get. Ethan looked out the window where Moose was pawing through leaves practicing his foraging lessons. I just don't know if he'll understand why I'm letting him go. Robert sighed. Maybe he already does. That night, rain rolled in again. Moose paced near the window, uneasy. Ethan sat beside him, humming softly. The bear, quieted, pressed his head against Ethan's shoulder. After a long silence, Ethan whispered, "You're not mine to keep. You never were." Moose made a sound, low, steady, almost like the hum Ethan used to soothe him as a cub. It wasn't a speech, but it was an answer. The next morning, when Layla arrived, Moose greeted her with his usual half-growl, half-greeting, something that sounded oddly like, "Hey," she laughed. "You're going to make my research famous." Ethan smiled faintly. He's already done more than that. As she loaded her equipment, the forest beyond the cabin shimmered with early sun. Everything felt temporary, poised on the edge of change. Before heading inside, Ethan turned back one last time. Moose stood at the tree line watching him. A pause then. A small familiar rumble, short, low, warm. Not a word, but something close enough to say thank you. That sound lingered long after he disappeared into the trees. For Ethan, it became more than a memory. It was proof that language wasn't just about speech. It was about recognition. The way one life can look at another and simply understand. Soon that understanding would be tested. Not by fire this time, but by fear noise and a storm that would remind them both what it truly meant to trust. By midsummer, Moose had become the unofficial mascot of the Miller cabin and the unintentional scandal of the valley. What began as whispers about the bear, the talk soon spread past their ridge. Hikers came hoping to catch a glimpse. A local blogger posted a blurry photo of Moose beside Ethan's truck captioned, "Tennessee's real-life talking bear." Within a week, strangers began slowing their cars near the gate. Some waved, others yelled for the bear to say something. Ethan had to put up signs. No trespassing, no photos, no feeding the bear. At first he tried to laugh it off. Moose was still his clumsy, curious black bear, the one who grumbled when he didn't get enough berries and hummed when he was content. But the attention brought new problems. Fear, misunderstanding, and the kind of noise that always finds its way into quiet lives. It started with the mailman. One hot afternoon, Moose wandered to the driveway just as the mail truck arrived. The driver froze mid-step, letters clutched to his chest. Moose tilted his head, gave a deep humph that to Ethan sounded like, "Who?" The driver screamed, dropped the mail, and sprinted back to his truck. That night, Ethan found his picture on a community forum titled, "Aggressive Bear Blocks Postal Route." Robert nearly spilled his drink laughing. Aggressive? He's too polite to swat a mosquito. Ethan didn't laugh. He knew how fast stories traveled and how easily they twisted. A few days later, a wildlife officer showed up. She introduced herself as Ranger Collins, clipboard in hand, tone careful. "We've had multiple reports of a bear living on your property. You're aware it's illegal to keep native wildlife without a permit?" Ethan took a slow breath. "He's not a pet. He's under temporary rehabilitation. Dr. Layla Harper is supervising." Collins nodded but scanned the property anyway. Moose, curious, poked his head around the porch railing, gave a low rumbling. "Hey." The ranger's eyes widened. "Did he just talk?" Robert grinned. "Depends who you ask." Collins scribbled something, murmured, "We'll need documentation." After she left, Ethan sat on the steps, rubbing his temples. This is getting out of hand. Robert shrugged. "You wanted to save him, not hide him. The world just caught up." That night he called Layla. She listened patiently. "It's bound to happen," she said. "The line between rescue and captivity isn't always clear to the public. But don't lose sight of why you started. Tell that to the people who think he's a threat. Fear's a natural response," she said. "But education calms fear faster than argument. Maybe it's time to show them what he really is." Ethan hesitated. The idea of public outreach felt foreign. He wasn't a showman. But a few days later, he tried a small experiment. He invited a handful of neighbors for coffee on the porch. Moose stayed behind the fence, calm but curious. "He's not dangerous," Ethan explained. "He's learning like any other creature." One man, Bill from next door, crossed his arms. "Learning my dog growls less than that thing." Moose gave a soft grunt, almost like a chuckle. The group laughed despite themselves. Tension loosened. Then a woman asked, "Can he really talk?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Depends on how well you listen." For a moment, everyone fell silent. Moose made a low, rhythmic hum, the same one he used when watching the forest. It wasn't words, but it carried meaning, steady, calm, curious. The air shifted. No one laughed. Sometimes understanding doesn't come through speech. Ethan thought it comes through quiet. After that meeting, the neighbors' tone changed. Not everyone was convinced, but some began dropping by with fruit or leftover bread, leaving them outside the fence. A few even helped repair the burned trails nearby. The valley, once wary, started to soften. Still, not everyone approved. One afternoon, while Ethan worked on the truck, Hank from town showed up again. "Heard they're talking about relocating the bear," he said. Ethan froze. Who's they? County officials? People don't like a wild animal living so close. Word is, some folks are calling it unnatural. Robert looked up from the porch. Unnatural. You ever see how humans act at a Walmart sale? Hank smirked. Just giving you a heads up. That evening, Ethan called Layla again. She confirmed the rumor. If complaints keep rising, they'll move him to a sanctuary early. It's not punishment, it's policy. Ethan didn't argue. He knew she was right, but knowing didn't make it easier. That night, Moose sensed the tension. He pressed his head against Ethan's leg, humming low. "You hear everything, don't you?" Ethan whispered. Moose huffed, almost a yes. "You trust too easily," Robert muttered from across the room. Ethan looked at him. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Over the next week, Ethan tried to keep things normal. Routine feedings, quiet mornings, and small lessons in foraging and scent recognition. But something had changed. Moose was restless. When cars passed on the nearby road, he'd stand, tall ears twitching. Once he even paced the fence line, making soft warning calls. "He's picking up on our stress," Layla said when she visited. "Animals mirror energy. If you stay calm, he will too." Easier said than done. Then came the tipping point. A family of tourists lost on the back roads spotted a moose near the fence and stopped for photos. When Ethan came outside, Moose was already near the gate, puffed up, uneasy. The father laughed nervously. "Don't worry, we're not close." The camera flash went off. Moose flinched, gave a sharp growl that reverberated through the valley. The tourists screamed, dove into their car, and sped away. Ethan ran to calm the bear. "It's okay, buddy." Moose's breathing slowed, but the damage was done. By evening, another report had reached the county office. Robert found his son staring into the fire that night. "You can't protect him from everything he said." Ethan didn't respond. "You remember when you were 12, tried to keep that injured hawk?" Robert continued. "You did your best, but the wild has its own clock. We're caretakers, not captors." Ethan sighed. "I know. It just feels like letting go means losing." Robert shook his head. "Sometimes it means trusting that what you taught sticks." The following morning, Ethan took Moose for a walk to the creek. Mist rolled low through the trees. Moose splashed in the water, pawing at fish he'd never catch. Ethan watched him play, realizing how far they'd come from that smoky day months ago. The cub who once trembled now commanded the forest with confidence. "You don't need me much anymore," he said softly. Moose turned his head, grunted something between denial and affection. Ethan smiled. Yeah. You talk too much." When they returned to the cabin, Layla was waiting. "The county's agreed to hold off on relocation for now," she said. "But they'll monitor from a distance. Keep things low profile." Ethan nodded with relief. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank Moose for behaving better than most people I've met." For a while, peace returned. The valley learned to live with its unusual neighbor. Some evenings, children from nearby farms would stop by the fence to watch Moose tumble in the grass. Their laughter mixed with his rumbling hums like a language of joy neither species fully owned. Robert, once skeptical, admitted quietly, "You know he's got better manners than most kids I taught in Scouts." Ethan chuckled. "Don't tell them that." But under the calm, something was shifting. Moose had grown nearly adult size now. His curiosity pulled him farther each day. Ethan started finding tracks near the tree line wider, deeper. Sometimes he wouldn't come when called right away. The forest was calling him back, as it always would. And though Ethan tried to ignore it, he knew the wild doesn't ask permission. It simply reminds you where you belong. That evening, thunder rolled in from the west. The sky turned heavy, the air electric. Moose stood by the door, sniffing uneasy. Ethan felt the same tightening in his chest he'd felt before the wildfire months ago. The sense that something was coming. "Storm," Robert said. "Big one." Lightning flashed over the ridge. Ethan knelt beside Moose, resting a hand on his thick fur. "It's just rain," he whispered. But even as he said it, a part of him knew this storm would test more than just weatherproof walls. It would test everything they'd built: trust, patience, and the fragile bridge between human and wild. As the first drops fell, Moose pressed closer, his breath warm and steady. Ethan exhaled, steadying himself. "We've been through worse," he murmured. The bear gave a soft, familiar rumble, the same one from that first night after the fire. A sound of recognition, of promise. Outside, thunder cracked, echoing across the valley. By the time the storm reached full force, neither man nor bear would sleep, and both would learn how thin the line between fear and faith really was. The first clap of thunder came before dusk, low and distant, like a warning. Ethan looked up from the porch and saw dark clouds swallowing the ridgeline, heavy with a kind of rain that never asked for permission. Robert was already tying down the loose tools by the shed. "She's gonna be rough," he muttered. Moose stood at the door, head tilted, nostrils flaring. The bear had sensed it hours before animals always do. Ethan ushered him inside and closed the shutters. The cabin lights flickered. The smell of ozone drifted in through the cracks. "It's just a storm, buddy," Ethan said, kneeling to rub Moose's shoulder. The bear rumbled, low, uneasy eyes darting to every sound. Lightning split the sky outside, followed by a thunderclap that shook the walls. Moose bolted for the corner, pressing himself low against the floorboards. His breathing quickened. Ethan's heart clenched. He'd seen that look before, the same frozen terror Moose had the first night after the wildfire. Robert poured coffee, voice steady. "He remembers." "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "So do I." The next flash lit up the cabin like daylight. Moose growled, pacing in tight circles. His movements weren't angry, they were desperate, trapped between instinct and fear. Ethan sat down on the floor, cross-legged, waiting. He didn't call, didn't force. Just waited until the bear's pacing slowed. Then he hummed, a low, rhythmic tone, the same melody he'd used to calm Moose when he was a cub. The sound cut through the storm like a thread of stillness. Moose's ears twitched. Another flash, another rumble. Ethan kept humming. Slowly the bear approached, stopping inches away, eyes wide and searching. Ethan whispered, "You're safe. It's not fire this time." The bear exhaled sharply and pressed his forehead against Ethan's arm. For a long moment, neither moved. It wasn't silence. It was the kind of stillness that holds everything steady when the world outside shakes. Robert watched from the table, his face soft in the candlelight. "You know," he said after a while, "you used to hate storms. You'd crawl into our bed until you were 8. Ethan smiled faintly. "Guess I grew out of it." "Looks like he didn't," Robert said, nodding toward Moose. "Or maybe he just knows what it feels like to be caught in the wrong kind of noise." Outside, the rain came harder, hammering the roof in sheets. Power flickered out. The cabin fell into darkness except for the glow of the fire. Ethan and Moose stayed where they were. Every time thunder cracked, Moose flinched, then looked at Ethan. Each time, Ethan answered the same way, steady, quiet, present. Hours passed like that. The world had narrowed to heartbeat, breath, and rain. It was strange, Ethan thought, how storms had a way of shrinking time. Fear couldn't stretch forever when something stronger, trust, kept it tethered. When the wind finally began to die, Robert stood and poured the last of the coffee. "You ever notice," he said softly, "how storms strip everything down? The noise, the pride, all that's left is whatever's real." Ethan glanced up. "Yeah, and sometimes what's real is scared and shaking on the floor." Robert smiled. "And sometimes what's real hums back instead of running away." The lesson wasn't lost on either of them. The storm was more than weather, it was memory. For Moose, it was fire returning. For Ethan, it was the reminder that healing doesn't erase the past. It just teaches you how to stand when it comes back. By midnight, the thunder faded to a dull rumble. Rain softened into a whisper. Moose finally lay down beside Ethan, head resting on his lap. The bear's body was heavy, warm grounding. Ethan leaned back against the wall, exhaustion settling in. "You did good," he murmured. "No fire, see? Just sky noise." Moose let out a deep sigh that sounded almost like relief. Robert threw another log on the fire. "He's not the only one who's learned something tonight." "What's that?" Ethan asked. "Patience," Robert said. "And that sometimes comfort looks like a man talking to a bear while the world falls apart outside." Ethan laughed quietly. "You make it sound strange." "It is strange," Robert said, "but good, strange. The kind worth keeping." They sat in companionable silence for a while. The storm lingered far away now, echoing faintly over the hills. Every flash of lightning illuminated the bear's coat, gleaming black flecked with drops of water. Every rumble seemed to fade a little more into memory. Ethan thought about how much had changed since the wildfire, the ash, the smoke, the fear, and how somehow all of it had led to this moment. A man, a bear, and a father sharing the same quiet after chaos. Later, when the rain stopped completely, Ethan opened the door. The air outside was cool, washed clean. The valley shimmered under moonlight, silver streaks glistening on every leaf. Moose stepped out cautiously, sniffing. The smell of wet earth replaced the smoke that once defined this place. For a second, Ethan thought he saw recognition in Moose's eyes, as if the bear understood what healing looked like now. Robert came up behind him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "See that?" he said. "Everything starts again after a storm. Even us." Ethan nodded. "Guess nature knows what it's doing." Robert smiled. "Always has. We're just late learners." They stood there watching Moose wander a few yards into the clearing, lifting his nose to the wind. Then, suddenly, the bear made a low, soft sound, almost like a hum, and turned his head toward Pshi, to the forest. It wasn't fear this time. It was awareness. The kind that comes when something inside you recognizes home. Ethan's chest tightened. "He wants to go farther." Robert didn't answer right away. "He will," he said. Finally, the wild's calling him back. The words hung between them, heavy but true. Moose looked back once, then ambled closer again, brushing against Ethan's knee. That single touch carried everything: gratitude, trust, understanding. It was a promise and a goodbye waiting in the same breath. Inside, they dried off, lit lanterns, and checked for damage. A few branches down a broken gutter, nothing more. The cabin had held. So had they. Ethan couldn't shake the thought that maybe the storm wasn't here to destroy, but to clear the path for what came next. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the valley, bright and unreal after the chaos of the night. Steam rose from the damp earth. Moose was already outside, sitting near the fence, staring toward the tree line. Ethan joined him quietly. "You remember last night?" he asked. Moose huffed. "You were brave." The bear gave a low rumble that sounded suspiciously like agreement. Ethan smiled. "Figures you'd talk back." Robert came out with 2 mugs of coffee. "You boys survive your therapy session?" Ethan grinned. "Barely." Robert handed him a mug. Storms are funny. You think they're about what's happening outside, but they're really about what's going on inside. Ethan took a sip, letting the warmth settle. Yeah, he said. Last night felt like we finally stopped running from the past. The lesson lingered in the air as tangible as the smell of rain. Fear doesn't vanish. It just loses power when you face it together. The wildfire had burned through their world months ago, but this storm had washed away what was left of that fear. The land felt new. So did they. As the day unfolded, Moose roamed the yard calmer now, occasionally grumbling softly, as if recounting his version of the night's events. Ethan watched him from the porch, a small smile playing on his face. "You tell it however you want," he said quietly. "You earned it." Layla stopped by later to check on them. When she heard about the storm, she said, "That kind of fear imprint takes years to fade. The fact that he stayed near you instead of hiding means you've replaced trauma with trust." Ethan nodded. "Or maybe he just decided I make a better shelter than a cave?" Layla smiled. "Maybe that's the same thing." That evening, as the sun set, Ethan took one last walk around the property. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, and the forest hummed with renewed life. He stopped at the edge of the clearing where the wildfire had once left only ash. Now, tiny green shoots pushed through the soil. He crouched, running a hand over the tender leaves. Nature, he thought, doesn't erase its scars, it grows through them. Behind him, Moose let out a low grunt, as if echoing the thought. Ethan turned. "You ready for what's next?" he asked. The bear blinked slow and steady. In that silence, Ethan heard the answer he already knew. Tomorrow, Layla would return with papers, plans for Moose's release into the sanctuary. The storm had ended, but another test was coming, learning how to let go without losing what mattered most. By early autumn, the air in the Smoky Mountains had shifted crisper, quieter, touched with the scent of pine and change. Ethan felt it before anyone said a word. Moose was restless again. The bear who once clung to the porch now spent hours staring into the forest, as if the trees themselves were calling him by name. He'd grown tall, broad-shouldered, his black coat catching every slant of morning light. There was a calm in him, but also distance. Ethan knew what it meant, even if part of him refused to admit it. Nature doesn't ask permission. It reminds you of where you belong. Layla visited one afternoon, clipboard in hand, her tone careful. "He's ready," she said. "He's passed every behavioral test hunting foraging awareness. The sanctuary can take him next week." Robert, standing nearby, exhaled slowly. "Seems fast," he muttered. Layla shook her head. "He's overdue, honestly. You've done more for him than most rescues ever get." Ethan didn't answer. He crouched beside Moose, brushing his fingers through the thick fur between his ears. The bear leaned in, eyes soft, but focused somewhere past him toward the ridgeline. It wasn't rejection, it was recognition. Instinct had finally woken. That night, silence filled the cabin heavier than any storm. Robert pretended to read the paper, though he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. Ethan sat by the hearth, listening to Moose's low breathing. "You think he knows?" he asked quietly. Robert looked up. "He's a wild animal. He probably knows better than we do." Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah, that's what scares me." The next morning, Ethan and Moose walked to the creek. The sun filtered through the trees, painting the water gold. Moose waded in, pawing at fish, splashing like he used to. For a while, Ethan just watched. Then quietly he said, "You remember the day I found you? You were nothing but bones and smoke." Moose glanced back, made a small throaty sound, something between a growl and a sigh. Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, I know. You've outgrown the sad stories." He threw a stick downstream, watching Moose chase it. Every motion carried grace, now strong, sure, effortless. There was no trace of the frightened cub, left only a creature ready for his own life. And still it hurt. Layla returned that afternoon with transport gear. A large carrier, soft restraints, and tranquilizer backup she hoped she wouldn't need. "We'll keep him in a transition pen for a few days," she explained. "Then the sanctuary. He'll have miles of protected forest, streams, berries, and other bears. Everything he needs." Ethan nodded, but the words blurred. Everything he needed except the small, quiet space they had built together. That evening, Robert cooked dinner, but no one ate much. Moose paced near the door, agitated by the movement of strangers, by a change he could sense but not name. When the sky darkened, Ethan stepped outside alone. The air was cool, sharp with wood smoke and memory. He sat on the porch steps, head in his hands. "You knew this was coming," he whispered to himself. From behind, he felt a weight, heavy, familiar. Moose pressed his forehead against Ethan's shoulder, huffing softly. Ethan laughed under his breath. "You always show up when I run out of words." He reached up, scratching behind Moose's ear. "You ready for this?" The bear snorted, almost offended by the question. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Robert joined them quietly. "You want me to help tomorrow?" Ethan nodded. "I might need you to drive." Robert's voice softened. "He'll be fine, son." Ethan nodded again, though he wasn't sure if that was true or if it mattered. The next morning, dawn broke clear and gold. Dew clung to every blade of grass. Moose followed Ethan without resistance, stepping into the transport crate with only a glance back. No sedation, no fight, just trust. The kind that said, "You've done your part." As the truck rumbled down the dirt road, Ethan kept his hand on the crate. Robert drove in silence, eyes forward. "You remember when we first found him?" Robert said eventually. "I told you it was a bad idea." Ethan smiled faintly. "You tell me that about most of my ideas." "And I'm usually right," Robert said. "But not this time." The sanctuary sat on the far side of the valley, hidden behind rolling hills. A wide expanse of fenced forest stretched beyond the gate, open, alive, safe. Layla met them at the entrance. "We'll let him acclimate slowly," she said. "He'll start in a half-acre enclosure, then move to full range once he finds his bearings." Ethan followed her to the release site. Moose stepped out cautiously, sniffing the air. His body tensed, then relaxed. He moved toward the trees, stopping once to glance back. Their eyes met. Ethan raised a hand, unsure what goodbye was supposed to look like between man and bear. "Go on," he whispered. "You're home." Moose tilted his head, gave a single low grunt, something between a farewell and a thank you, and turned toward the forest. Within seconds, the dark shape disappeared between the trees. The sound of his steps faded into the leaves. Ethan stood there longer than he meant to. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. "He didn't leave you," he said. "He just went where he was meant to." Ethan swallowed hard. "Yeah, guess we both did." They drove back in silence. The cabin felt impossibly still without the bear's presence. The usual sounds, clinking dishes, whined through shutters, sounded too loud, too empty. Ethan walked from room to room, half expecting a soft rumble or a misplaced shoe. There was none. That night, the quiet became unbearable. Ethan stepped outside and sat on the porch, watching the moon climb over the ridge. The forest glowed faintly in its light, alive but distant. He traced his thumb over a deep scratch in the porch railing, a mark Moose had left months ago. It wasn't damaged anymore. It was memory. Robert joined him with 2 mugs of tea. "You did right," he said simply. "You gave him a life, not a cage." Ethan didn't reply. He just stared into the trees, every rustle sounding like a possibility. A few days passed. Life settled into its old patterns, but the air felt different, lighter, emptier. Then, one morning, as Ethan was fixing the fence, he heard a noise from the woods. A low, rhythmic hum rising and falling. He froze. It came again. Not close, not far, just there. Familiar. Robert stepped out, squinting toward the sound. "That's what I think it is." Ethan nodded, smiling through the sting in his eyes. "He's saying hi." They stood there listening until the sound faded. No chase, no calling back. Just quiet acceptance. Later, Ethan walked to the creek where they used to play. On the muddy bank, half hidden by fallen leaves, were paw prints fresh large heading toward the sanctuary side of the forest. He knelt, pressing his hand beside one. The shape fit perfectly inside the outline. "You found your way," he whispered. He stayed there until the sun dipped low. The water carried reflections of orange and gold across the surface. A small breeze lifted, carrying the scent of pine and rain. For the first time since Moose's release, the emptiness didn't feel like loss. It felt like space. Space for whatever was next. On the walk back, he noticed something else. Green shoots are breaking through the charred ground near the old burn line. Nature, relentless as ever, is doing what it does best, starting over. He smiled. Maybe love works the same way. You don't replace what's gone. You make room for what grows in its place. That evening, Robert found him fixing a loose shutter. "Can't sit still, can you?" "No," Ethan said, tightening a screw. "But I can breathe again." Robert nodded. "That's enough." As night settled over the valley, the forest hummed with quiet life, crickets, wind, and somewhere in the distance one faint familiar sound. A low rumble rising and fading like a promise carried on the air. Ethan leaned against the railing, smiling. "Good night, Moose," he murmured. "You're still watching, aren't you?" He stood there until the stars came out, feeling the same calm he used to feel when the bear lay beside him, both of them listening to the same world, breathe. By morning, the valley would shimmer again with early light. And though Moose was gone, his echo remained in the prints in the air and the way Ethan looked at every living thing as if it might one day come home again. The forest looked different that fall, greener, denser, louder with life. The charred stumps that once marked the wildfire's path were now draped in moss. Birds had returned, woodpeckers tapping in a steady rhythm like a heartbeat against bark. Ethan walked those trails often now. He didn't speak, didn't call out, but sometimes he caught himself listening. Listening for a sound he both hoped and feared to hear. It had been months since Moose's release. The sanctuary sent updates through Layla. The bear was thriving, strong, independent, avoiding people, leading other males toward food sources, and even chasing off a coyote once. "He's exactly what we hoped for," she said. Ethan always smiled when she told him, but the truth was quieter. Pride and absence had begun to feel like the same thing. Robert noticed the shift too. "You're out there every day," he said one morning over breakfast. "You looking for him or yourself?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. On one of those mornings, a thin fog clung low between the trees. Ethan carried a thermos of coffee and followed the creek to where the forest thickened. The air was still. Then, soft rhythmic, came a familiar hum. He stopped. Breath caught. It wasn't imagination. The sound rolled through the trees, low and sure, fading just as quickly as it came. He smiled, not calling out, just standing there in the quiet. "Still keeping tabs on me," he murmured. The sound didn't return, but something lighter stirred inside him, a knowing, not a longing. Later, when he told Robert, his father nodded slowly. "I heard it too last night," he said. "Thought I was dreaming. Guess he's still around?" Ethan chuckled. "You mean haunting us?" "Nah," Robert said. "Just checking if we remembered our manners." Days grew shorter, the valley colder. Ethan started helping Layla with other rescues, injured foxes, an orphaned fawn, even a red-tailed hawk that refused to perch. Each animal carried a piece of that same silent language Moose had taught him, presence before words. He noticed how people rushed to comfort with noise, but healing always began with stillness. "Funny," Layla said once as they worked together. "You used to fix everything fast. Now you wait." Ethan smiled. "Guess I learned that from a bear." One evening, while clearing fallen branches near the creek, he found something unusual. Claw marks etched deep into a tree trunk. Fresh. 4 long grooves, wide and clean. He placed his palm beside them. The spacing matched Moose's size perfectly. He looked around, scanning the forest. Nothing, only the sound of wind moving through branches. But the marks told enough. Moose had been here close enough to see the cabin, maybe even close enough to hear their voices. He told Robert that night. He came back, Ethan said. I saw the marks. Robert smiled, eyes soft. Told you the wild remembers its own. They stood by the window looking out at the moonlit ridge. You think he'll ever come back for good? Ethan asked. Robert shook his head. Coming back isn't the point. It's knowing you can. That line stayed with him. Coming back isn't the point. It's knowing you can. Through the winter, Ethan worked on small repairs around the property. He rebuilt the bird feeders, restacked the woodpile, and cleared the pond path Moose used to patrol. The land felt alive again, less haunted, more shared. One night when snow began to fall, he stepped outside to close the shutters and saw a set of tracks by the fence. Large, rounded prints leading from the tree line to the porch, then away again. The distance between them was wide, powerful. He crouched, tracing one with his hand. You still watching? He whispered. The next morning, he found Robert standing in the doorway, steaming mug in hand. You see them too? Robert asked. Ethan nodded. He was here. Then he's fine, Robert said simply. As days passed, the tracks disappeared under new snow, but the feeling remained. Moose wasn't gone. He'd just changed roles from companion to guardian. The idea brought peace instead of ache. Ethan began teaching workshops at the sanctuary about wildlife coexistence. He shared his story, never dramatized, just truth. Rescue isn't ownership, he told one group of volunteers. It's stewardship. It's knowing when care becomes control. People nodded, some taking notes. Others just listened. It was clear his words carried weight because they weren't theory, they were lived. Layla approached him afterward. You know, that's what most people miss, she said. They think love means keeping, but the wild doesn't work that way. Ethan smiled. Neither does healing. That night back at the cabin, the wind picked up again, carrying a faint scent of pine and damp earth. The fireplace crackled. Robert dozed in his chair the same way he used to when Ethan was little. The world felt cyclical, connected like the lines between past and present had blurred into something softer. Before bed, Ethan stepped onto the porch. The moon was full, washing the valley in silver light. Somewhere deep in the woods, an owl called. Then another answered. For a long while, that was all. Then, faint but distinct, came a familiar sound, a low rumble followed by a pause like punctuation. He smiled without turning toward it. Good night, old friend. Moments later, rain began to fall. Not heavy, just a whisper. The scent of wet leaves filled the air, the same scent that once marked the beginning of Moose's recovery. The rhythm of drops against wood blended with the soft rush of wind through the pines. It felt like the valley itself was breathing. Robert appeared behind him, rubbing his arms against the chill. You're talking to the trees again? Maybe, Ethan said. They answer back sometimes. Robert looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Guess I can't argue with results. They stood together under the porch light, both listening. The mystery wasn't whether Moose was truly near. It was how his presence lingered in everything: the air, the ground, the choices they made. Nature had a way of leaving echoes in those who cared for it. And maybe that was the point. Rescue goes both ways. When spring returned, the first green buds appeared on the same trees that once stood blackened by fire. Ethan and Robert planted new seedlings along the ridge. For him, Robert said. For all of them, Ethan corrected. As they worked, they heard movement deeper in the woods, branches rustling, a low grunt, then silence. They looked at each other and smiled. No need to confirm what both already knew. By evening, the valley glowed with that rare light that only appears after rain, soft, forgiving, almost holy. The hills that once burned now shimmered with color. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. And maybe that was perfection enough. As they packed up their tools, Robert paused. You ever think he'll forget you? Ethan shook his head. Animals don't forget kindness. They just carry it differently. That night, as dusk settled, Ethan wrote in his journal a habit he'd picked up during Moose's rehab days. He wrote about cycles, about storms that clean instead of destroy, about how even absence can leave warmth behind. Then, almost without thinking, he added one line, "Sometimes echoes last longer than voices." He closed the book, blew out the lamp, and let the dark fill the room. Outside, the forest pulsed with life crickets, owls, wind, and somewhere far off that same low hum rose and fell again. This time it wasn't a goodbye. It was simply the world speaking back. The next morning, a new sound would break that rhythm. A small, uncertain cry from the woods near the old shed. And for Ethan, it would mark the beginning of another story, one that proved love always finds its way home. It was a little after sunrise when the sound came again, a faint, broken cry from behind the shed. Ethan froze, pruning shears still in hand. At first, he thought it was a bird caught in a wire. Then it came again, softer this time, shaped like a question. He followed the sound through the dew-damp grass, heart steady but curious. There, under a fallen beam near the woodpile, was a tiny bundle of dark fur. A black bear cub, smaller than his forearm, trembling its paw, caught between the boards. Its eyes blinked up at him full of fear, but not panic, like it already understood help was coming. Ethan crouched, speaking softly. "Hey there, Easy. You're okay." He moved the wood slowly until the cub slipped free, stumbling forward. The little bear tried to stand, wobbled, then pressed its head against his boot, as if the world made sense there. Ethan lifted it carefully into his arms. The cub's body was warm, heartbeat fast. Then, just as he whispered, "You're safe now," it made a small, rough sound, a short chirp, almost like a word. Not quite hey, not quite high, but close enough to send a shock straight through his chest. Robert stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand. "What did you find this time?" Ethan looked up, voice tight with disbelief. "Another one." Robert blinked. "Another bear?" "Yeah. Alone." The older man sighed, shaking his head, but his eyes softened. "You've got a sign on your back that says, 'Vacancy for lost animals.'" Ethan laughed quietly. "Maybe it's time to take it down." "You won't," Robert said. They wrapped the cub in an old towel, checking for injuries. It had a sprain, but nothing broken. Ethan warmed milk on the stove, memories flooding back, measured scoops. Careful temperature, the way Moose used to nudge the bottle impatiently. The cub drank greedily, then looked up milk on its nose and gave another tiny grunt. "That's the sound," Ethan whispered. "It's almost the same." Robert set down his cup. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Ethan nodded. "We'll name him Echo." The next few days were a blur of déjà vu. Feedings, cleaning, late-night checkups. Echo's behavior mirrored Moose's early days, cautious but curious, slow to trust, quick to learn. Only this time, Ethan moved differently. He didn't rush, didn't panic. Every motion came with patience earned from the first rescue. He realized that Moose had prepared him for this every lesson, every quiet night, every goodbye. Love, he thought, doesn't disappear. It just teaches you what to do next time. Layla stopped by when she heard the news. "You're becoming the unofficial bear whisperer," she joked, checking Echo's vitals. "He's lucky you found him." "Maybe he found me," Ethan said. "Seems to be a pattern." Layla smiled. "Funny how life works. You heal one, and the next one shows up right when you're ready." That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge, Echo toddled across the floor, tripping over his own paws. He spotted his reflection in the glass door, puffed up and let out a defiant growl no bigger than a sigh. Robert chuckled. "Looks like he's got Moose's attitude." Ethan smiled, resting a hand on the cub's back. And his timing. When night fell, the cabin filled with the soft hum of the forest crickets, wind-distant owls. Echo curled beside the hearth, his breathing deep and even. Ethan sat nearby, notebook open. He wrote a line he'd heard once but only now understood. "We don't find the wild. The wild finds us when we're quiet enough to listen." He thought about all the people who would watch this story someday, those who'd feel the same pull towards something fragile, something unspoken. He wanted them to know that rescue wasn't just about animals. It was about recognizing the small broken things in ourselves and learning how to nurture them back to life. Moose had taught him that. Echo was here to remind him again. A few nights later, thunder rolled faintly over the valley, far gentler than before. Ethan noticed Echo stiffen, glancing toward the window. "It's okay," he whispered, kneeling. "It's just the sky talking." The cub hesitated, then let out a low, almost human-sounding hum. It wasn't fear, it was mimicry. Comfort learned through tone. Ethan smiled. "You talk too, huh? Guess it runs in the family." That sound filled the cabin like light. It wasn't loud, but it carried meaning the same way Moose's hum once had. It was as if the bear's memory had rippled through time, carried in this new life, continuing the conversation where it left off. The next morning, Ethan walked to the old tree line. The claw marks from months before were still visible, faint now, worn by weather, but never gone. He placed his hand against them. "You sent him, didn't you?" he said quietly. Wind moved through the branches, rustling leaves like an answer. Echo, sitting a few feet behind him, let out a tiny chirp. The sound was so close to Moose's that Robert, standing on the porch, turned his head sharply. "Did you hear that?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, he's got a voice already." That afternoon, Layla called with an update from the sanctuary. "We think Moose has taken over the part of the Northern Territory," she said. "He's healthy dominant, and get this, he's been seen guiding 2 younger males near the river." Ethan smiled, looking down at Echo. "Guess he's still teaching." As the sun set, Ethan took Echo outside for the first time. The cub sniffed the air, tentative but brave. Fireflies drifted between the trees, blinking like tiny lanterns. "That's the world," Ethan whispered. "Big, messy, beautiful. And one day it'll be yours." Echo made a sound short, firm, like an acknowledgement. Ethan laughed softly. "Of course you'd answer back." He stayed out long after dark, listening to the hum of the forest. Every sound, the frogs, the rustle of leaves, the distant river, felt alive with memory. It struck him how the wild doesn't mourn the way people do. It keeps moving, keeps growing, even after fire, even after loss, and in that movement it carries love forward. Later, sitting on the porch beside Robert, Ethan said quietly, "You ever notice how every ending here just becomes another beginning?" Robert took a sip of coffee, smiling. "That's nature for you. It doesn't waste anything, not even grief." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, guess it recycles hearts too." They sat in silence, watching Echo chase fireflies near the porch steps. The cub stumbled, tumbled, then got up again, unbothered. Robert chuckled. "He's clumsy." So was Moose, Ethan said. "Guess some things don't change." Inside, the lamp flickered, casting warm light across the cabin walls. Echo climbed onto Ethan's lap, paws too big for his body, and made that same quiet hum again. Ethan stroked his back gently. "You're safe," he whispered. The cub blinked slowly, as if understanding. Then in that half-sleep moment where truth slips through words, it made a soft, breathy sound that almost resembled home. Robert heard it too. He didn't say anything, just smiled and looked toward the window where moonlight cut across the trees. Somewhere out there, maybe on a distant ridge, a full-grown black bear might have lifted his head at the same moment, sensing the echo of his own voice carried forward. And that's how the forest speaks, through memory, through sound, through everything we choose to care for. You give love to one wild thing, and somehow it finds a way to keep talking long after it's gone. Ethan looked down at the cub curled in his lap and whispered, "Welcome home, Echo. Let's start again." Then he turned to the camera on the nearby table, recording quietly as part of his new project with the sanctuary, and said, "If you've made it this far, maybe you've heard your own version of this story. Maybe you've found something small and fragile and thought, I can't fix this, but you can help it live. You can learn from it. That's how the world gets better. One act of care, one quiet rescue at a time." He smiled, gentle but certain. So if this story reminded you of anything worth saving yourself, your faith in the world, the wild things still out there, take a second before you go. Think about what you can protect right where you are. He glanced at the cub, who gave one last sleepy grunt, like punctuation to the moment. Ethan laughed. And hey, if you want to keep hearing stories like this about bears and the people who try to understand them, you know what to do. Hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a little reminder that love doesn't end. It just finds a new voice. He reached over, turned off the camera, and for a moment the cabin returned to its old rhythm. Soft breathing, slow fire, the forest whispering outside. Somewhere in that blend of sound and silence, the world spoke back again, and Ethan listened.